The Alpha King arrested the fleeing maid, until his pups revealed why she escaped. The stone floor was cold beneath Alara's feet, even through the thin soles of her worn shoes. But she had learned long ago not to complain about cold floors. She had learned not to complain about much of anything. That was the first rule of being a servant inside the walls of King Daemon's estate, and Alara had followed it every day for 3 years without a single slip. She moved quickly through the lower corridor that connected the kitchens to the grand hall, her arms full of freshly pressed linens, her eyes fixed on the floor ahead of her. The corridor was lit by iron lanterns that hung from hooks in the stone ceiling, and the light they gave was orange and trembling. Shadows moved at the edges of everything. Servants did not look at the walls here. Servants did not stop walking. You kept your pace steady, you kept your head down, and you disappeared into your task, the same way water disappeared into dry earth. Alara was very good at disappearing. She was 23 years old, with dark brown hair that she kept twisted and pinned at the back of her neck, and eyes the color of oak bark after rain. She was not tall, and she was not remarkable in any visible way, which suited her perfectly. The maids who drew attention in King Daemon's household were the ones who ended up reassigned, relocated, or simply gone, and Alara had no interest in any of those outcomes. She had come to this estate 3 years ago with a forged recommendation letter and a careful story about her origins, and she had worked hard every single day since then to make sure no one had reason to look at her too closely. The grand hall was being prepared for the blood moon ceremony, and that meant everyone was working twice as hard and speaking half as much. The blood moon came once every 3 years, when the wolf moon hung so low in the sky it looked bruised and swollen, red at its edges like a wound that would not close. For the pack, it was the most sacred night of the year. For Alara, it was the most exhausting. She set the linens down on the long wooden table at the far end of the hall, and began folding them into the shapes she had been taught. The ceremony required everything to be perfect. The candles had to be placed in specific positions. The wolf crest above the fireplace had to be polished until it reflected the light properly. The long table, where the council would sit, had to be covered in white cloth, and every chair had to be exactly the right distance from the one beside it. Alara folded the linens without thinking about it. Her hands knew this task the way feet knew how to walk. Around her, other servants moved in practiced silence, each one absorbed in their own duty. The only sounds were the soft footsteps on stone, the occasional scrape of a chair being moved, and the distant rumble of voices from somewhere deeper in the estate. Then the doors at the far end of the hall opened, and the voices stopped being distant. King Daemon entered the room, the way a storm moved across an open field. He did not announce himself. He did not need to. He was 6 feet and 4 inches of perfectly controlled tension, with dark hair cut close at the sides and left longer on top, and eyes that were a particular shade of gray that Alara had only ever seen in the sky directly before a thunderclap. He wore a dark shirt with the sleeves rolled to his elbows, which meant he had come from his study and not from a formal meeting, and 2 of his generals walked half a step behind him on either side, trying to keep up without appearing to rush. Every servant in the hall went still, for exactly 1 breath, then resumed their work with precisely the kind of focused determination that said they were absolutely not watching the king cross the room. Alara kept folding linens. She was on the far side of the table, which meant she was partly hidden behind the drape of white cloth, and she intended to stay that way. "The arrangement of the east seating is wrong," Daemon said, without breaking his stride. His voice was low and even, the kind of voice that carried without effort. He had the accent of the northern territories, a slight hardness on certain consonants, but otherwise his speech was measured and precise. "I told Gareth 2 days ago. Has he corrected it?" One of his generals, a broad-shouldered man named Lieutenant Colt, who Alara recognized from the courtyard patrols, spoke quickly. "I'll have it sorted before evening, sir." "Not before evening, now." "Yes, sir." Daemon's path through the hall brought him toward the long table where Alara was working. She kept her eyes on the linen in her hands, folding a corner down with deliberate care, but she was tracking his movement the way prey tracks a predator, with her whole body, every nerve alert. He stopped about 4 feet from where she stood. She did not look up. One of the other maids across the table, a girl named Clara, who had only been at the estate for 6 months, and therefore still had not yet learned the absolute importance of keeping her gaze down, made the mistake of looking directly at the king. Alara saw it happen in her peripheral vision, and felt a small clench of concern on the girl's behalf. But Damon was not looking at Clara. He was looking at Ilara. She felt it before she saw it. There was a particular quality to the awareness of being watched by someone who carried real authority, a warmth on the skin that had nothing to do with temperature, a shift in the air pressure of the room. Ilara had been a servant long enough to recognize that feeling. She had learned to deflect it by making herself smaller, stiller, more invisible. She folded another corner of the linen and did not look up. After a moment, she heard Damon move away, continuing across the hall with his generals, resuming his conversation about the seating arrangement. She let out a breath, so slow and careful, that it made no sound at all. Clara caught her eye from across the table. The younger girl's eyebrows were raised in a silent question. Ilara shook her head the smallest amount possible. Not here. Not now. She mouthed the word, later. Clara nodded and went back to her work. The preparations continued through the afternoon. Ilara carried, arranged, folded, and fetched without a pause. The estate was a large one, built from gray stone that had been added to and expanded across several generations of Alpha Kings, and there was always more ground to cover than there were hands to cover it. She went from the grand hall to the upper corridor, from the upper corridor to the kitchens, from the kitchens back to the hall, and so on, until her feet ached and her shoulders were stiff, and the light through the narrow windows had shifted from pale gold to deep amber. By the time she returned to the servants' quarters in the late afternoon, to change her apron and collect herself for the next round of duties, she had almost convinced herself that the moment in the hall had been nothing. The king looked at things. That was simply what kings did. He had probably been looking at the table, or the wall behind her, or checking the progress of the preparations. It meant nothing. She sat on the edge of her narrow bed and pressed the heels of her hands against her eyes. The servants' quarters were on the lowest level of the estate, a long room divided into small sleeping areas by wooden partitions that gave the illusion of privacy without providing much of the actual thing. Ilara's space was at the far end, which she preferred because it was close to the small window that faced the north garden, and on nights when the air was heavy with summer heat, a little of the garden's cool breeze found its way in. She had 3 things on the small shelf above her bed. A book of simple stories she had brought with her from her previous life, so worn from reading that the cover had lost its color entirely. A small tin that contained a dried flower. She did not want to think about where the flower had come from, and she did not allow herself to look at it for long when she opened the tin. And a folded piece of paper that she had not opened in 3 years, because she knew exactly what it said, and she did not need to read it again. These were her 3 things. She had kept herself light, which was smart, because light things were easy to carry when you needed to move quickly. She heard Clara come into the servants' quarters and drop onto her own bed 2 partitions down, with the heavy thud of someone who had been on their feet for 8 hours straight. "My legs are done," Clara said, through the partition. "My legs have submitted their formal resignation. I'm operating without them now." Despite everything, Ilara almost smiled. "You'll need them for the ceremony tonight. The ceremony is in 3 hours. My legs can resign for 2 hours and 50 minutes, and then come back for the last 10. Ilara stood up and smoothed her uniform. "Have you served at a blood moon ceremony before?" "No. You?" "Once. 2 years ago." She paused. "Stay close to the walls. Don't speak unless spoken to. And if anyone from the council addresses you directly, answer yes or no, and nothing more. The council members on Blood Moon Night are not in the mood for conversation." "Why not?" She considered how to explain it without saying too much. "It's a very serious night for them. Old traditions, old feelings. The moon does something to the wolf instinct that makes everyone more intense." "Intense." Clara's voice was cautious now. "What does that mean exactly?" "It means you'll feel it in the air the way you feel pressure before a storm. Don't let it rattle you. Do your job, stay invisible, and it will be over by midnight." There was a pause. "You're very good at giving advice about being invisible," Clara said, and her tone was curious rather than unkind. "You're the most invisible person I've ever worked alongside." "That's a skill," Ilara said simply. "It takes practice." She took her apron from the hook on the partition and tied it behind her without another word. Ilara stood near the east wall of the grand hall with a long-handled candle snuffer in her hands, her job for the evening being to extinguish specific candles at specific moments in the ceremony, as directed by the estate's head steward, a thin, gray-haired man named Mr. Hollis, who communicated through a series of small hand gestures that Alara had memorized over the past week. The hall had been transformed. The candles she and the other servants had placed were now lit, and there were so many of them that the room glowed as if it were burning from the inside out. The white cloths on the long table were smooth and bright. The wolf crest above the fireplace gleamed. The council members were seated, all 12 of them in their dark ceremonial coats, their faces bearing the particular expression of people who were feeling something large and important, and choosing not to show it. And at the head of the table, in a chair that was slightly taller and broader than the others, without quite being a throne, sat Damon. He had changed from the practical dark shirt she had seen him in earlier. He wore a long coat the color of midnight, with the estate crest embroidered in silver at the collar, and his posture was the kind of posture that came not from trying to look powerful, but from actually being it. The difference was visible. Alara had learned to see it. The ceremony itself was largely silent. There were spoken words, passages read aloud by the eldest council member, a man so old his hands shook slightly as he held the book, but the passages were in an old form of the pack language that Alara did not fully understand. She followed the rhythm of them rather than the meaning. The council responded at certain points with a low sound that was not quite a word, a collective sound from 12 people at once that moved through the room like a vibration. Alara watched Mr. Hollis from her position near the east wall. He raised 2 fingers. She moved to the first candle in her row and extinguished it with quiet precision. It was during the 3rd reading that she felt it again. She was standing still, waiting for the next signal from Mr. Hollis, her eyes properly forward, when the sensation moved over her like a slow wave, that same shift in pressure she had felt earlier in the afternoon, that same warmth on the skin that had no visible cause. She knew without looking that Damon was watching her. She stood still for 3 full seconds, her breathing controlled, her expression neutral, and then she made a choice that she would later understand was either very brave or very foolish. She looked up. He was watching her, directly, openly, without any attempt to disguise it. The rest of the council was engaged in the ceremony. The elder was still reading from the book. The 12 council members had their eyes forward, but Damon had turned his head very slightly and was looking at Alara with an expression she could not immediately name. It was not the look of a king inspecting his household. It was not the look of a superior noting an employee. It was something she had never seen on anyone's face before, a look of recognition, as if he had turned a corner he had turned 100 times before, and found something new standing there that he had not expected and could not explain. The look lasted less than 3 seconds. Then his gaze moved back to the ceremony, and his expression returned to its usual careful blankness, and Alara looked at the floor again, and the candle snuffer was slightly heavier in her hands than it had been a moment ago. She told herself it meant nothing. She told herself that for the rest of the evening, with the focused, practiced determination of someone who had a great deal of experience telling themselves things that were almost certainly not true. The ceremony ended at midnight, as she had told Clara it would. The candles were extinguished. The council members spoke quietly among themselves and then filed out. Servants moved through the hall collecting glasses and gathering used cloths. The estate slowly shifted into the quieter rhythm of late night. Alara helped clear the long table without speaking. Clara worked beside her, yawning behind her hand every few minutes, too tired by this point to keep up the earlier chatter. The walk back to the servants' quarters took them past the wide stone staircase that led up to the estate's upper levels. They were almost past it, when Alara heard a voice above them on the stairs, calm and low, and immediately recognizable. She kept walking, but she caught the words. Damon was speaking to someone above, presumably one of his generals. His voice was quiet, but the corridor carried sound well, and Alara heard him say, "Find out who the girl on the east wall is, the one with the dark hair." There was a brief pause, a murmur she couldn't distinguish, and then his voice again. "I know what she is. I'm asking who she is." Alara did not stop walking. She did not look back. She kept her pace perfectly steady, all the way to the servants' quarters, and then she sat on the edge of her narrow bed in the dark for a long time without lighting her candle. Her 3 things sat on the shelf above her, the book, the tin, the folded paper. She looked at them in the dim light that came through the small window from the garden outside. She had been very careful for 3 years. She had been invisible for 3 years. She had told herself that she had found a safe place, a quiet life, a pattern she could maintain indefinitely. And in a single evening, the Alpha King of the Northern Territories had noticed her. Her hand moved toward the tin on the shelf, then stopped. She had told herself she would not open it. She had made that rule, and she had kept it for 3 years. And she was going to keep it tonight as well. She lay down on her bed without undressing, and stared at the ceiling. There were 17 cracks in the ceiling above her bed. She had counted them many times. Counting them helped her think, and she needed to think very clearly right now. She needed to decide, quickly and without sentiment, exactly what the king's interest in her might mean, and exactly what she needed to do about it. The ceiling had 17 cracks. She counted them once, slowly, and by the time she reached 17 she had not made any decision, except the one she made every single day without naming it. She was not ready to leave yet. She would give it one more day. She would watch. She would be careful. She would stay invisible. One more day. She told herself this with the specific and blameless confidence of someone who did not yet know that one more day was exactly one day too many. Outside, the blood moon hung in the sky, swollen and red at its edges, and the world it looked down on was quietly, permanently different from the world it had looked down on the evening before. Things had shifted in the way that important things shift, not with noise or announcement, but with the slow, certain weight of a tide that has already turned before anyone on the shore has noticed that the water is moving. Elara closed her eyes. In the upper rooms of the estate, the Alpha King stood at his window and looked at the moon and said nothing, because there was nothing to say yet about a feeling this new and this inconvenient and this entirely outside his understanding. Below, in the north garden, a single light burned in a small window. It went out just after 1 in the morning. Neither of them slept easily that night. And the estate itself, the old gray stone and the iron lanterns, and the cold corridors between everything, held all of it in the way that old buildings hold the lives that happen inside them. Quietly, completely, without judgment, without release. The morning after the blood moon ceremony came in gray and slow, the way mornings after important nights often do, as if the sky itself needed time to adjust to what had changed while it was dark. The birds in the north garden were louder than usual. The air had a particular edge to it, cool and clean, the kind of air that made everything feel slightly more real than the day before. Elara was already awake before the bell rang. She had been awake for most of the night. She lay on her back in the narrow bed and listened to the sound of the estate beginning its daily rhythm around her, the distant clang from the kitchens, the footsteps of the early rising staff, the creak of a door being opened somewhere above, and she made a decision. She was going to be even more invisible today than she usually was. She rose, dressed quickly in the dark, and was the first of the maids in the servants' quarters to reach the kitchen. Cook Aldridge looked at her over the rim of his morning cup of tea with eyebrows raised. He was a large, cheerful man who had worked in this kitchen for 14 years, and who measured the quality of a day almost entirely by how early his bread rose. "You're up with the sun," he said. "Extra duties today," she said, which was not entirely a lie. "The hall needs checking after last night. Hollis will have a list." "I know. I just like to get ahead of it." Cook Aldridge nodded and returned to his bread. Elara took a bucket of warm water and a cloth and went to the grand hall. She worked methodically and without hurry, wiping down the long table, straightening the chairs, checking the candle holders for dripped wax. The hall in daylight was much quieter than it had been the night before. Smaller feeling, more ordinary. The wolf crest above the fireplace looked like carved stone instead of something ancient and alive. The white cloths on the table, folded now and stacked in the corner, were simply linen. She worked until she heard footsteps in the corridor outside. She did not panic. She moved to the far side of the table and continued wiping it down with steady, unhurried strokes. If you were busy when someone found you, you were harder to speak to than if you were standing still. It was not the king. It was Lieutenant Colt, the general she had noticed beside Damon the day before. He was younger than she had first realized, perhaps 30, with a square jaw and short red hair, and the particular posture of someone who had spent years training himself to look larger than he was. He stopped in the doorway of the grand hall and looked at her. "You're the east wall maid," he said. She kept wiping the table. "I'm one of the household staff, yes, sir." "Name?" "Elara, sir." "Elara what?" She had an answer ready for this, The same answer she had given to the head steward 3 years ago when she was first employed. Alara Voss, sir. Colt looked at her for a moment, with the expression of someone running a check on something they can't quite place. You've been here how long? 3 years, sir. And before that? I worked in a household in the Western Reaches. I have my reference on file with Mr. Hollis. I'm sure you do. He glanced around the hall briefly, as if confirming she was alone. The king wants a word with you. Alara's cloth paused on the table surface for exactly half a second before she resumed wiping. With me, sir? With you. His tone was not unkind, but it was firm. When you're done here, report to the study on the second floor. Hollis will show you where. Of course, sir. He left. She listened to his footsteps disappear down the corridor. Then she stood very still, her cloth in her hand, and looked at the table she had been cleaning. The study on the second floor was where Damon conducted private business. The servants knew this. They also knew that the reasons for being called there were very few, and most of them were serious. Dismissal, discipline, occasionally, reassignment. She folded her cloth neatly and placed it at the edge of the table and went to find Mr. Hollis. Mr. Hollis was a man who communicated almost entirely through the expression of mild professional concern, regardless of what was actually happening. He showed Alara to the second floor with the same face he would have shown her to a linen cupboard, and knocked on the study door with 2 crisp taps before opening it and stepping aside. She went in. The study was large but not showy. It was the room of someone who worked seriously in it rather than someone who used it to impress visitors. There were shelves of books along 2 walls, but they were not decorative books. They had the worn look of things that had been read. There was a wide desk near the window, covered in papers and maps and a writing set that appeared to be in regular use. A fire burned in the hearth on the far wall, which seemed extravagant for morning, but made the room feel warmer and steadier than the stone corridors outside. Damon was standing at the window with his back to her when she entered. He was in a dark shirt again, no coat, and he had his hands in his pockets in the way of someone who was thinking rather than posing. He did not turn immediately. She stood 2 steps inside the doorway and waited. Then he turned. In daylight, without the ceremony's candlelight and without the distance of the grand hall, he was different. Sharper. The gray of his eyes was more complex up close, not a flat color but something that shifted slightly, like water over stone. There was a tiredness around them that had not been there yesterday, which meant he had not slept well either, and Alara did not want to think about what that might mean. He looked at her for a moment without speaking. She kept her face neutral and her hands loose at her sides and waited. You've been here 3 years, he said. It was not a question. Yes, sir. Alara Voss. Yes, sir. From the Western Reaches. Yes, sir. He moved away from the window and sat on the edge of the desk, crossing his arms. The posture made him look less formal, which was somehow more unsettling than formality would have been. I'm told your work record is excellent. No complaints, no incidents. I try to do my job well, sir. You do. He paused. You're also extremely good at not being noticed. She said nothing. Most members of my household staff I've spoken to within the first 6 months of their employment. I make it a practice to know the people who work in this estate. He looked at her steadily. I have never spoken to you before today. I didn't want to disturb your time, sir. My role doesn't require direct contact with... I know what your role requires. His voice was not harsh, but it was precise, the way a blade is precise. I'm saying I noticed, last night, that I had never noticed you before, and I found that unusual. Alara held his gaze and said, carefully, I'm not sure I understand what you mean, sir. Yes, you do. The silence that followed was brief but complete. She changed her approach. Arguing would draw more attention. Agreement would end the conversation faster. I apologize if my manner seemed avoidant, sir. I simply believe in doing my work without drawing attention. There's a difference between professionalism and effort, he said quietly. Last night you were making an effort. She did not respond. He looked at her for another moment, and then something shifted in his expression, a small change, a kind of consideration being weighed. Before the Western Reaches. That's where I'm from, sir. I've been in service since I was 17. You speak like someone who's been educated. I read a great deal, sir. He made a small sound that was not quite a laugh. I'm sure you do. He stood up from the desk and moved toward the window again. and she felt the room relax slightly, the way a room relaxes when the pressure of direct attention lifts. "I'm not trying to frighten you," he said, with his back to her. "I simply found myself curious." "Of course, sir. You can go." She turned toward the door. "Alara." She stopped. "I'll be assigning you to the upper corridor duties starting this week, closer to the family's quarters. Hollis will explain the schedule." She stood very still, the upper corridor, closer to the king's own rooms, closer to the twins' nursery floor, further from the anonymous safety of the lower levels. "Thank you, sir," she said, and her voice was perfectly steady. She walked back through the door and down the stone stairs and through the corridor to the kitchens without stopping, and then she stood in the corner of the scullery and took 3 slow, deep breaths, and then she went back to work. Clara found her 20 minutes later, sorting through the morning's cleaning assignments. "You were summoned," Clara said quietly, appearing beside her. "Colt told me." "What happened?" "Nothing," Alara said. "A brief conversation." "About what?" "My work duties. I'm being reassigned to the upper corridor." Clara blinked. "The upper corridor? That's—" She trailed off, because they both knew that the upper corridor assignments were typically given to senior staff who had been in the estate for many years. "Yes," Alara said. "Is that a good thing?" Alara picked up her cleaning list and studied it with focused attention. "I don't know yet." But she did know. That was the difficulty. She knew exactly what it meant when a powerful man moved the pieces around him to keep someone close. She had been watching this estate for 3 years. She understood how it worked. She understood the nature of kings. She went about her morning duties with the same quiet efficiency she always brought to them, room to room, task to task, and she listened to the estate around her with more care than usual, the way you listen more carefully to a place when you are beginning to consider whether you might need to leave it. The estate spoke in the language of footsteps and whispers, and the particular way doors opened and closed. By mid-morning she had learned that Damon had cancelled his afternoon meetings, which he almost never did. She learned, through the quiet network of servants who passed information the way rivers pass water, that Lieutenant Colt had been asking questions about her in the lower kitchens. Not hostile questions, simple ones. How long had she been here? What was she like? Was she close to any of the other staff? She carried a tray of folded letters up to the second floor just before lunch, which was not part of her usual duties but which Mr. Hollis had assigned with no explanation, and as she turned to come back down the stairs, she nearly walked directly into Damon, who was coming up them. She stopped. He stopped. They were 3 steps apart on the stone staircase, and there was no way to make this disappear into ordinariness. "Sir," she said, stepping back and to the side to give him room to pass. He did not move immediately. He looked at her with that same expression she had seen in the ceremony, the one she still did not have a name for. "You don't need to announce yourself every time," he said. His voice was quieter here on the stairs, without the carrying quality of the hall. She did not know what to say to that, so she said nothing. He went up the stairs past her. She went down them. She did not look back. In the kitchen, Cook Aldridge was telling one of the younger boys that the bread had risen perfectly, and this was a sign that the day was going to be fine. He said this every day when the bread rose well, and on the days it didn't, he simply didn't mention it. Alara thought about the bread rising. She thought about signs and what they did and did not mean. She thought about the tin on the shelf above her bed, and the dried flour inside it, and the folded piece of paper she had not opened in 3 years. She thought about the upper corridor assignment, and Lieutenant Colt's quiet questions, and the way the Alpha King had stopped on a staircase to tell her something she hadn't known how to receive. She helped serve the midday meal to the lower staff and ate her own portion standing at the kitchen counter because the table was full, and she was quiet all through it, in a way that was different from her usual quiet. Her usual quiet was deliberate and comfortable. This quiet had an edge to it, like cloth stretched too tight. "You're thinking hard," Cook Aldridge observed, refilling her cup of water without being asked. "Just tired," she said. "Blood moon night will do that." He returned to his work. "Gets in the blood, that moon does, even for those of us who aren't wolves." She looked at him. "You feel it too?" "Everyone in this estate feels it, girl." He cracked an egg against the bowl's edge with practiced ease. "You can't live inside a pack's walls for long without some of it getting into you. That's just how it works." She thought about that. She thought about it for the rest of the afternoon. By the time the evening came and the lamps were being lit in the lower corridors, and the estate was settling into its night rhythm, Ilara had made no new decision about anything except one. She was going to be more careful, more deliberate, more invisible than she had ever been. She was going to give nothing away. The blood moon was already gone from the sky. A regular moon sat in its place, pale and ordinary and small, and the night was cool and very dark at its edges, and somewhere in the north garden, a bird called once and then went silent. Ilara lay in her bed and counted the 17 cracks in the ceiling, and told herself that everything was still manageable. Everything was still within her control. Outside her window, the north garden breathed slowly in the dark, and the old gray stone of the estate held everything it knew in perfect silence. She was still believing what she told herself. For now, that was enough. She did not plan the night she ran. That was the important thing. The thing she would have said to anyone who asked, though she knew no one ever would. She had not packed the bag in advance. She had not chosen a night, mapped a route, or waited for the right conditions. What happened was simpler and more frightening than any plan. She simply woke up at 2:30 in the morning, sat upright in her narrow bed in the dark, and knew with absolute clarity that she had to leave the estate before the sun came up. The knowing was not like a thought. It was like the sound of something falling in another room, abrupt and undeniable. She was up before her mind had fully caught up to her body. She moved in the dark without lighting her candle. She had spent 3 years learning every creak and irregularity of the servants' quarters floor, which boards were safe to step on and which ones spoke. She moved from her bed to the small shelf above it and took down her 3 things. She tucked the book inside the lining of her cloak. She put the tin into the front pocket of her dress, against her ribs where she could feel it with every breath. The folded piece of paper went into the inside pocket of the cloak, which had a small button to keep it closed. She dressed in her warmest things. She put on her cloak. She tied her shoes sitting on the floor beside her bed, so the act of tying would not make the bed frame creak. Around her, the servants' quarters were deeply asleep. She could hear Clara's slow breathing 2 partitions down, the kind of breathing that belonged to someone in the middle of a dream. She stood in the dark and listened to it for one moment, because it was the sound of something ordinary and safe, and she was walking away from ordinary and safe, and she knew it. She did not feel sad. She felt the cold clarity of a decision that has already been made by the time you recognize it. She went out through the servants' door at the back of the lower level, the one used for kitchen deliveries after dark that was left on a simple latch after 8 o'clock in the evening, out through the service yard, past the woodpile and the stable block and the side gate that was always the last gate to be locked at night, because it was the farthest from the main building, and the guards on the night circuit reached it last. She had, at some point in the past 3 years, made a habit of noticing exactly these things, without ever consciously deciding to. Which doors closed when, which gates latched at what hour, which part of the perimeter wall was lowest, with a stone mounting block on the garden side that a person of her height could use to reach the top. She had told herself that she noticed these things simply because she was observant by nature. She had not allowed herself to think about the other reason, which was that she had always known this night would come. She went over the wall in the dark and dropped down onto the packed earth of the lane on the outside. She landed in a crouch, absorbed the impact, straightened. The lane stretched ahead of her into the dark. At the end of it was the road. At the end of the road was the forest. She did not look back at the estate. She had learned long ago that looking back was one of the more effective ways to stop yourself from moving forward, and she could not afford to stop. She walked. The road at night was different from the road in daylight. It was narrower, somehow, and the hedgerows on either side were taller and darker, and the sounds were all different, crickets and owl calls and the occasional distant sound of something moving through the fields that was probably just a fox, but felt larger. She kept to the edge of the road where the grass muffled her footsteps, and she walked at the pace of someone who was not hurrying, because hurrying was conspicuous, and she had not survived 3 years in a werewolf king's household by being conspicuous. She reached the tree line just before 3 in the morning. The Ashwood forest began where the open farmland ended, a wall of dark trees that appeared quite suddenly after the last field, the kind of forest that had been old before anyone living could remember. The estate's grounds did not extend into it, neither did the pack's formal patrols, at least not during the night hours. She had been told this by one of the older stable hands who had worked at the estate for 20 years. and who occasionally talked about the forest with a particular mixture of respect and nervousness. "Wolves don't go in at night," he had said once, when she had asked. "Not even wolves like ours. There are things in old forests that even the pack gives room." She had filed that information away at the time without knowing why. Now she walked into the trees. The dark under the canopy was a different quality of dark than the open road. It was layered. There were sounds she could not identify. The ground was uneven and covered in roots, and she had to slow her pace to avoid turning an ankle, which would have been catastrophic. She kept moving north, using the sky where she could glimpse it through the canopy to orient herself. North was away from the pack's main territories. North was toward the human settlements that she knew existed along the river 2 days' walk from here. Communities that traded with the pack, but operated largely outside its governance. She had thought about this. She had thought about it without letting herself fully commit to thinking about it, which was a particular skill she had developed, the ability to hold a plan in the part of her mind that did not keep records. She walked for 2 hours without stopping. Then she stopped. Not because she was tired, though her feet were beginning to make a case for rest. She stopped because she heard something behind her. She stood very still between 2 large trees and listened. At first there was nothing, except the forest's own sounds. Then, faintly, she heard it again. The sound of something moving through underbrush with the kind of deliberate quiet that meant whatever was moving was trying not to make noise, and was very good at it, but was covering ground too fast to be entirely silent. It was too large to be a fox. She started moving again, faster now, no longer worried about being conspicuous because there was no longer any question about whether someone was tracking her. The question now was only how far behind they were. She moved north through the trees, following a slight downward slope that she hoped would lead to water. Water would mask her scent. She had read this in a book, years ago, the kind of practical information that had seemed theoretical at the time and now felt urgently specific. She found the stream about 20 minutes later, a cold, shallow thing running over smooth stones that caught what little moonlight filtered through the canopy. She waded in without hesitating. The water was shockingly cold around her ankles, then her calves. She walked upstream for what she judged to be about a quarter mile, her breath coming faster now, her shoes soaked through, the cold spreading upward through her legs. She came out on the other side on a bank of exposed rock and kept moving. Behind her, in the dark, she heard nothing for a long time. Then a sound she recognized, even though she had never heard it so close before. A wolf call. Not a dog, not anything domestic or ordinary. The sound of a wolf communicating across a distance, a long, rising note that the trees shaped and dispersed but did not silence. It was answered, after a moment, from a different direction, and then a third answer, from further away. She was surrounded. Not immediately. They were still at a distance, but the pattern of the 3 calls formed a rough triangle, and she was somewhere inside it, and she understood from the sound of the calls that they were not yet closing in. They were marking her position, reporting to someone. She walked faster. She did not run, because running in a dark forest over uneven ground was how you broke bones, and because something in her understood, clearly and without panic, that if the wolves tracking her had wanted to overtake her immediately, they could have done it before she even reached the stream. They were not overtaking her. They were hurting her. The thought was not comforting. An hour before dawn, she came out of the trees onto an open slope that looked down onto a collection of low stone buildings, a village. Small, maybe 30 or 40 houses, with smoke beginning to rise from a few chimneys in the way that smoke rises in the very early morning from the homes of people who rise before the sun. She moved toward it quickly, following a worn path down the slope. She was halfway down the path when she heard the footstep behind her. One footstep, perfectly placed, making only the minimal sound that rock striking rock will make, regardless of care. She stopped walking. The silence that followed had a particular quality. The kind of silence that a person who is very disciplined and very controlled makes in the space right before they decide to speak. "You're faster than I expected," said a voice behind her. She recognized it immediately. She had spent the past 3 weeks memorizing it against her will. She turned around. Damon was standing 6 feet behind her on the path, alone. He was wearing dark, practical clothing, without any of the ceremony or formality she had seen him in before, and in the gray pre-dawn light he looked different than he did in the estate. Harder, somehow, and less guarded. The way people look when they believe they are in a context where certain kinds of pretense are irrelevant. His boots were muddy from the forest. His expression was unreadable. He was alone. "Where are your guards?" she asked. The question came out before she could think about whether it was wise. "Waiting at the tree line." He did not move toward her. "I wanted to talk to you without an audience." "Talk to me," she repeated. "Yes. You sent wolves after me in the middle of the night to ask for a conversation. I sent trackers after you in the middle of the night, because a member of my household fled without explanation in the middle of the night." His voice was even. Both things can be true at once. She looked at him steadily. Behind her, the village was waking up. She could hear the low murmur of it. She could walk toward those sounds, and he could not follow her into a human settlement without causing an incident. She knew this. She also knew that two of the wolves who had called in the forest were almost certainly positioned between her and the village, and that the path she was standing on was not the only path they would have covered. "You're going to bring me back," she said. It was not a question. He said nothing for a moment. When he spoke, his voice had shifted slightly. Not softer exactly, but less formal. "I want to understand why you left. My reasons are my own. Not when you're part of my household. I gave 3 years of good service. My departure is not a crime. Leaving in the middle of the night without notice is a breach of contract." "Then find me," she said. "I'll pay back whatever I owe." Something moved in his expression. Not anger. Something more complicated. Ilara. She hated the way her name sounded in his voice. It sounded like something that belonged there, and it had no right to. "Don't," she said quietly. He looked at her with that expression she still did not have a word for. "Come back," he said. "Not as a servant. Just come back, and tell me what you're afraid of." "I'm not afraid." "You are," he said gently, "and you have been since the moment I first noticed you. I want to know why." She looked at him for a long moment in the gray dawn light, with the cold from the stream still in her shoes, and the tin pressed against her ribs, where she could feel it with every breath. And she thought about what it would mean to tell the truth to a man like this. What it would cost, what it would set in motion. "I can't tell you," she said, "and I can't go back." "Why?" "Because if I do," she said, "everything changes, and I'm not ready for that." He studied her. The light was growing slowly around them, the sky moving from black to a deep bruised blue at the horizon. In that light, his face was very still and very attentive. "I'm going to ask you to come back anyway," he said. "And if I refuse?" He was quiet for a moment. "Then I will bring you back," he said, "because you are my responsibility, and you are not safe in that forest alone, and there are things you do not know that make your leaving dangerous in ways I cannot fully explain to you, on a hillside at dawn." She looked at him. "And if I say none of that is your business?" "Then I will disagree with you," he said, "and bring you back anyway." She exhaled slowly through her nose. Behind her, the village smoke rose in thin white lines against the darkening blue sky. Below her on the path, the Alpha King stood in his muddy boots, with his hands loose at his sides, and watched her, with the expression of a man who was, for reasons she suspected he did not fully understand himself, not going to move from that spot without her. She thought about running. She thought about it practically, the way she thought about most things. The slope below her was steep. The guards at the tree line were behind her. The village paths were likely watched. She thought about the tin pressed against her ribs. She thought about 3 years of perfect invisibility, and how efficiently it had been undone by a single blood moon ceremony and a man who had noticed her without being asked to. She thought about what he had said. "Things you do not know." "You are going to have to give me a very good reason," she said, "to walk back through that forest." "I know," he said. "And it had better be the truth." "It will be." She looked at him for one more long moment. Then she turned and looked at the village below, the smoke and the low rooftops and the ordinary morning sounds, the life she had been moving toward, and she understood that she was not going to reach it today. Not like this. Not with wolves at the tree line and the Alpha King blocking the path. She turned back. "All right," she said, "but I walk beside you. Not behind, not in front. Beside." Something shifted in his face, a change too small to name. "Agreed," he said. And they went back into the forest together, in the growing light of a dawn that neither of them had expected to share, the king and the maid, side by side as promised, and the trees held the sound of their footsteps without comment, and somewhere behind them, the village finished waking up and got on with its morning, and the moment that it almost happened slipped sideways into the category of things that very nearly were. The wolves at the tree line saw them coming and said nothing. The guards at the perimeter, when they arrived, kept their faces carefully without expression. Nobody asked her why she had run. Not yet. But the question was in the air around all of them for the entire 3-hour walk back, present as a fourth companion, patient and exact, waiting for the right moment to sit down and be answered. She walked the whole way in wet shoes and did not complain once. Neither did he. The walk back through the forest was 3 hours and 20 minutes. Ilara counted. She counted in the way she counted ceiling cracks, not because she needed the number, but because counting was something her mind did when the rest of her was occupied with staying very still on the inside. The guards moved through the trees around them and practiced silence, always at a distance, never intrusive, but present the way walls are present, not a statement, just a fact of the surrounding environment. Damon walked beside her as he had agreed to do. He did not speak for the first hour. She did not speak either. She had nothing to say that she was ready to say, and she had learned that silence was not a problem to be solved. Silence could be simply a space where speaking had not yet become necessary. Most people were uncomfortable with long silences. She had noticed that about people. The discomfort would push them to fill the quiet with things they had not necessarily planned to say, and those unplanned things were often more honest than the planned ones. She was not trying to use that against him. She simply knew it, the way you know things you have spent years observing. He spoke first, after approximately 60 minutes, on a section of path that ran along a shallow ridge, with the trees thinned enough on one side to let in the morning light. How much did you know about the estate when you applied for work here? It was a careful question. Not the most dangerous one he could have asked, but near it. I knew it was a well-run household with regular pay, and a good reputation for treating its staff fairly, she said, which was more than I could say about some of the alternatives. And the pack aspect of it didn't concern you? I had worked alongside pack-adjacent households before, not directly in a pack estate, but nearby. I understood the basic nature of it. Most humans prefer to keep their distance. Most humans don't need employment as urgently as I did. He was quiet for a moment. You chose the estate deliberately. She glanced at him. I chose it because it was available, and it was legitimate, and it paid on time. The reasons were practical. Humans who come to work in pack households for purely practical reasons, he said slowly, usually leave within the first year. They find the environment unsettling. The hierarchy is different from what they're used to. The wolves have ways of moving and communicating that feel foreign to human staff. It makes people nervous. I don't unsettle easily. I noticed that. He looked ahead at the path. I also noticed that you knew exactly which candles to put out at the ceremony last night, and in what order, without Hollis signaling you twice. That's not something you learn from reading a manual. She said nothing. You'd seen the ceremony before, he said. Not here, but you'd seen something like it. She walked steadily through the morning light and said, I observe carefully, and I learn quickly. That's all. That's one possible explanation. It's the correct one. He did not push it further. He asked instead about her 3 years at the estate. Ordinary questions. Which duties she had found most demanding. Whether she had found the winters in the Northern Territories difficult. Whether she had friends among the staff. She answered each question honestly where she could, which was most of the time, because the safest lies are the ones built almost entirely from truth. He was good at questions. She had known this, theoretically, from 3 years of watching how he operated. He ran a large and complicated estate with a significant number of people in it, and he kept control of it not primarily through force or fear, but through a particular quality of attention. He paid attention to things. He remembered things. He asked the right question at the right moment, with the kind of patience that made the conversation feel comfortable, right up until you realized how much ground had been covered. She liked him, in the specific and contained way that she allowed herself to like things, carefully, from a distance, without letting the feeling get out of hand. She was aware that liking him was dangerous. She had been aware of this since approximately the second week of her employment, when she had watched him spend 45 minutes in the kitchens with Cook Aldridge, learning why the bread had risen badly, not because it affected him in any practical way, but because he wanted to understand it. That kind of curiosity in a man that powerful was either very reassuring or very threatening, and she had spent 3 years deciding which, and had not entirely finished deciding. At the 2-hour mark, the trees began to thin, and the familiar shapes of the estate grounds appeared through the gaps. "I want to ask you something," Damon said, "and I want you to answer honestly." "I usually do." "When you ran last night," he said, "was it because of something that happened, or because of something you were afraid was going to happen?" She considered the difference between those two things. Then she said, "The second one." He was quiet for a moment. "What were you afraid was going to happen?" They had reached the edge of the tree line. The estate wall was visible from here, gray stone against the pale morning sky. One of the guards had moved ahead and was speaking quietly to someone at the gate. "Many things," she said. "Name one." She stopped walking. He stopped beside her. She looked at the estate wall and thought about the tin pressed against her ribs, and about the folded piece of paper in her cloak pocket, and about the 3 years she had spent being very careful for very specific reasons. "I was afraid," she said slowly, "that your attention would have consequences that I was not prepared to manage." He was very still beside her. "My attention," he repeated. "Yes. What kind of consequences?" She looked at him directly. "The kind that cannot be undone." He held her gaze for a long moment, in the gray morning light, at the edge of the Ashwood forest. And his expression did something complicated that she did not try to interpret. And then he said, very quietly, "And now?" "Now I'm back," she said. "Which answers the question, I suppose." He said nothing. He turned toward the estate gate and walked, and she walked beside him as agreed, and the guards fell into step at a respectful distance, and the morning light grew stronger around them, and the estate opened its gate with the sound of old iron that needed oiling, and she walked back in. The first person she saw inside the estate walls was Mr. Hollis, who stood near the side entrance with the expression of mild professional concern that served him in all situations, and who looked at Alara for exactly 1 moment before redirecting his gaze to the king. "Sir," he said. "She'll need a change of clothes and something to eat," Damon said. "Then I'll want her in the east sitting room." "Of course." Mr. Hollis looked at Alara with the small upward movement of one eyebrow that was his version of a question. She gave a very small nod. She was all right. He accepted this and led her inside. She changed her wet shoes and her cloak in the servants' quarters. Clara was not there, already at her morning duties. The space felt very still and slightly unreal, the way familiar places feel after you have tried to leave them and failed. She sat on the edge of her bed for 1 minute, with her cloak folded across her lap and the tin in her hands. She opened the tin. The dried flour inside was small and white, a simple thing, the kind that grew along the edges of streams in the western reaches in summer. She looked at it without touching it. It was brittle with age. The color had faded from white to a pale yellowish cream. She could still remember the exact morning she had pressed it between 2 pages of the book on her shelf, the specific quality of the light, the sound of the stream nearby, the particular way the day had felt before everything changed. She closed the tin. She put it back in the pocket of her dress, against her ribs, and went to find something to eat. Cook Aldridge gave her bread and tea at the kitchen counter without comment, and she ate it standing up the way she had eaten the previous day's lunch, quick and practical, refueling without ceremony. Then she went to the east sitting room. The east sitting room was on the ground floor, a room she knew from her cleaning rounds. It was smaller and more comfortable than the study, with 2 chairs near the fireplace and a small table between them, and a window that looked out onto the kitchen garden. It was a room for conversations that were supposed to feel less formal than the study, but the distinction was probably more meaningful to the people doing the hosting than to the people being received. Damon was already there when she arrived. He had changed from his forest clothes into something cleaner. He was sitting in one of the chairs, not behind a desk, which was different from the morning before when he had used the desk as a kind of distance-keeping measure. She sat in the other chair without being asked. He looked at her for a moment with the same considering expression she was beginning to recognize as his default setting when she was in the room. Then he said, "You said there would be consequences you weren't prepared to manage." "Yes." "Are you prepared now?" She looked at the fire. "No, but I'm back anyway." So it seems that the question has rearranged itself. Into what question? She looked at him. Into what happens next. He leaned forward slightly, his elbows on his knees, his hands loosely folded. It was the posture she had seen him use when he was engaged with something, not performing attention but actually giving it. Tell me what I should know, he said. Not everything. Start with whatever feels most important. She thought about this for a long time. The fire crackled quietly between them. I'm going to ask you something first, she said. He waited. The blood moon ceremony, she said. The night before last, when you looked at me during the reading, what did you feel? He was still for a long moment. That's not a question I was expecting, he said. I know. What did you feel? He looked at the fire. Then he looked back at her with the particular honesty of someone who has decided that deflection is no longer appropriate. Recognition, he said, which I cannot explain, because I had barely seen your face before that evening. She nodded very slightly. What does that tell you? She asked. He held her gaze. Something moved through his expression, a comprehension arriving slowly, the way complex things arrive, in stages rather than all at once. It tells me, he said carefully, that there is something here that I have not fully understood yet. Yes, she said, there is. And you know what it is. She looked at the fire again. I have a very strong suspicion. I have had it for some time. I've been working hard at not confirming it. Why? She pressed her hand flat against the pocket of her dress, against the tin beneath the fabric, a gesture so small he probably did not see it. Because confirmation, she said, is the thing that cannot be undone. He was quiet. Outside the window, the kitchen garden was bright with morning light, the herbs in their rows, the stone path between them, a cat sitting at the corner of the wall, watching something in the grass with the absolute, focused patience of cats. I want to understand, he said. I'm asking you to let me. She looked at him. 3 years of careful distance, 3 years of ceiling cracks and wet shoes, and forged recommendation letters, and the particular discipline of never allowing herself to want things that were too large or too close. All right, she said. But slowly, one piece at a time. As slowly as you need. She took her hand away from the pocket and placed it in her lap. Then here is the first piece, she said. My name is Ilara Voss. That part is true. And the rest of it? The rest, she said, is going to take more than one morning. He settled back in his chair, with the patience of a man who understood that some things cannot be hurried by force, only by trust, and that trust was a thing that built itself at its own pace, regardless of what you wanted from it. Then we'll take the time, he said. She nodded. The cat in the kitchen garden caught whatever it had been watching, and carried it away, with the unhurried dignity of something that knows exactly what it is, and where it belongs. Ilara watched it go. She thought, one piece at a time, start small, see if he is what he appears to be. And then, underneath that, please let him be what he appears to be. She folded her hands in her lap and looked at the fire, and began, very carefully, in simple words and in the right order, to tell the Alpha King of the Northern Territories the first true thing about herself that she had told anyone in a very long time. The fire listened without judgment. So did he. And the morning moved around them the way mornings do, indifferent and steady and full of small ordinary sounds, while inside the east sitting room something was being carefully, tentatively, irrevocably begun. The east sitting room became, over the course of the following week, the most consistent place Ilara had ever sat in her life. She came there each morning after her duties were done, which Damon had quietly arranged with Mr. Hollis, an hour carved from the middle of the morning, with no explanation given to the wider staff beyond the vague authority of the king's preference. She sat in the same chair each time, the one with its back to the window so the light came over her shoulder rather than into her eyes, and he sat in the other chair, and they talked. It was, she told herself firmly, nothing more than that. She told him about the western reaches, not everything, not the important parts, not yet, but enough to establish the shape of a life. She described the landscape, the wide flat fields that turned silver in autumn, the way the river moved differently in summer than in winter. She described the household where she had first worked as a young woman, the older woman who had employed her and taught her everything she knew about running a large household efficiently. She described the forged letter with the kind of careful honesty that dressed the admission in practicality. She had needed a position. She had secured one in the only way available to her at the time. He listened without interruption, which was not nothing. A man with his authority and his schedule could have turned these conversations into something else, a debrief, an interrogation, a formal accounting of her history. He did not. He listened the way someone listens when they are genuinely interested, rather than looking for specific information. She noticed this, and she noticed herself noticing it, and she put a deliberate distance between the noticing and any conclusions she might be tempted to draw from it. On the third morning, he told her something in return. He did it simply, without ceremony, in the middle of a conversation about the estate's history. He said, "My wife died 4 years ago." She already knew this. 3 years of working in the household had made it impossible not to know. But she said, "I'm sorry," because it was true, and because knowing something secondhand and being told it directly are different experiences, and the second one requires acknowledgement. The twins were 2 years old, he said. He was looking at the fire when he said it, not at her. Rowan and Cale. "Yes, I've seen them in the corridor sometimes." He looked at her then. "Do they remember you?" "I bring them bread rolls from Cook Aldridge sometimes, when I pass the kitchens on my way to the upper corridor. They started ambushing me around the second corner past the stairs." She paused. I hope that was appropriate. Something moved in his face, not quite a smile, but close to it, and she understood from the distance it covered, to reach the surface, that smiles did not come easily to him, and that this one mattered more because of that. "It was appropriate," he said. They sat with that for a moment. "They like you," he said. "They like the bread rolls. Cale told me you showed him how to make a paper bird from a square of folded paper." She considered this. "He asked me to show him. I wasn't sure if I should encourage a distraction from his lessons. He's been making them for a week. There are paper birds on every surface in their rooms." He said this with a tone she was still learning to read, something between exasperation and something warmer. "His tutor has lodged a formal complaint." "I apologize." "Don't." He looked at the fire. "They don't have enough of that." She understood what he meant. She did not say so. She simply accepted it and moved on, because some things are better left sitting where they are than picked up and examined. On the 5th morning, Lieutenant Colt knocked on the sitting room door with a report that required Damon's attention, and Damon took it and read it without asking Alara to leave. She sat in her chair and waited while he read, looking out the window at the kitchen garden. The cat was there again. It had become a sort of fixed point for her, something steady and uncomplicated. When Damon set the report down, he said, "There's been a request from Lord Varick's household. He's asking about the status of my domestic staff." She kept her expression still. "Is that unusual?" "Varick has been in a dispute with me about certain estate policies for 2 years. He uses whatever leverage he can find." He folded the report with precise hands. "He's been asking about you specifically." She felt the cold shift through her that she had learned to manage rather than show. "About me. He says he has a record of a maid matching your description, leaving a position in his territory 3 years ago. He wants to confirm whether the maid now employed here is the same one." She breathed carefully. "And what will you tell him?" He looked at her directly. "That depends entirely on what you tell me." She held his gaze. She thought about the tin pressed against her ribs, and the folded piece of paper, and the 17 cracks in her ceiling, and all the careful invisible work of 3 years. She said, "Lord Varick's territory was where I worked before I came here. I left his household service without notice, because I had reason to believe that staying was unsafe." "Unsafe in what way?" She chose each word carefully. "The household was run by his estate manager, a man named Soren. He had a particular way of making clear to female staff that certain kinds of helpfulness were expected of them that were not in any formal contract." Damon was very still. "I left when it became clear that no amount of professional distance was going to be adequate," she continued, "and that making a formal complaint to Lord Varick himself was not a realistic option, because Soren was his cousin, and pack hierarchy does not favor a human servant's word over a cousin's." The room was very quiet. "I forged the letter," she said. Because I needed to be somewhere that could not be traced back to his territory, and because a maid without a reference letter cannot find work in any decent household. I did not plan to stay here this long. I planned to move on after a year, somewhere further from the Northern Territories. I didn't, because this was, she paused, the first place in several years that felt like it had solid ground under it, and I made the mistake of staying somewhere that felt solid. She finished. She looked at the fire. The silence lasted approximately 10 seconds. Where is Soren now? Damon said. His voice was very even. I don't know. I assume still at Varric's estate. Another silence. The formal complaint, he said, if you made it now, to me, rather than to Varric. She looked at him. Pack law has provisions, he said carefully, that Varric's internal hierarchy cannot override. An Alpha King's jurisdiction supersedes a lord's in matters of this nature. If you were to make a formal statement. I don't want to make a formal statement, she said. I want to do my job and stay invisible and not be the subject of anything formal. I know. He was looking at the fire now. But Varric is going to push. He will want to know whether his estate manager's delinquency is documented anywhere. He will want to know whether you're a problem. Am I? He turned and looked at her. Not to me. She absorbed that. What you're telling me, she said slowly, is that now that Varric knows I'm here, the invisibility is no longer an option. It becomes more complicated, he said. Yes. She thought about this for a long moment. Then what are my options? She asked. He was quiet for a moment, and she watched him think in the particular way he thought, not restless or performative, but very still, the way still water is still, holding a depth that the surface doesn't show. You could leave, he said. I won't stop you, this time. If you chose to go, I would ensure you had a legitimate reference letter and enough money to get wherever you needed to go. She looked at him. Or, he said, you could stay, and I would handle Varric's inquiry. Handle it how? By telling him that my household staff are my concern, not his, and that his inquiry is noted and rejected. He paused. Varric is a lord in my territory. He has significant latitude. But there are things he cannot do without my consent, and accessing my household records is one of them. She was quiet. Why would you do that? She said. He looked at her with that expression she had been trying to name for a week. She was closer to naming it now than she had been before. It was not quite tenderness, and not quite authority. It was something that lived between those two things, in the space where a person becomes responsible for something they had not planned to be responsible for. Because, he said, you have done nothing wrong. And I do not allow my household to be used as leverage in petty political disputes. She held his gaze. That is one reason, she said. Yes. Is there another? A very small pause. There might be, he said. She looked away first, back at the kitchen garden, at the cat sitting on the wall in the morning light doing absolutely nothing, except being exactly what it was. I want to stay, she said. I need you to understand why that is a complicated thing for me to say. I'm beginning to understand it. You're only beginning. I know. He settled back in his chair. Tell me the rest of it, when you're ready. She pressed her hand against the pocket with the tin inside, and thought about ready. She thought about what the word meant to someone who had spent 3 years preparing to leave at any moment. Ready and safe were words she had been keeping at arm's length for a long time. She thought about paper birds on every surface in the twins' rooms. There is something, she said carefully, that I have not told you, that I have not told anyone, that I have been carrying alone since before I came to this estate. He waited. She pressed her hand flat against the tin, against the ribs beneath it, against what the tin did and did not represent. I am not ready to say it yet, she said, but I'm closer than I was a week ago. That's enough, he said. Is it? For today, he said. Yes. She nodded. She looked at the fire. She thought about all the things that were moving toward each other in the dark, like two hands seeking the same point from different directions, converging on something she could not stop, and was beginning to wonder if she wanted to. She thought, one more day. But this time the words had a different quality, less like a decision and more like a tide. In the evening, she went back to the servants' quarters and lay down on her bed and looked at the 17 cracks in the ceiling, and she realized she had stopped counting them. It was Rowan who found her first. She was cleaning the window ledge at the far end of the upper corridor, where the stone held dust no matter how many times it was wiped, when she heard small, deliberate footsteps coming around the corner, with the particular quality of footsteps that were trying to be sneaky and were not quite succeeding. She did not look up. The footsteps stopped about 2 feet away from her. There was a small, concentrated silence. She said, without turning, "Hello, Rowan." A pause. Then, "How did you know it was me?" Cale drags his left foot slightly when he's trying to be quiet. "Don't." Another pause, and then the sound of him sitting down on the floor behind her, with the unself-conscious drop of a 6-year-old who has no concerns about his trousers. She finished the window ledge and turned around. Rowan was sitting cross-legged on the stone floor, looking up at her with eyes the exact shade of his father's, that complex gray that changed in different lights. He was wearing clothes that had been put on correctly that morning and were now rumpled in the specific way of children who have been engaged in active independent investigation since approximately breakfast. "Where is your tutor?" she asked. "Fell asleep," Rowan said, without a trace of guilt. "Mr. Finch fell asleep?" "He was reading to us, and then he wasn't reading anymore, and his chin went down like this." Rowan demonstrated with his own chin, a slow, deliberate descent toward his chest. "And Cale?" "Making birds. He's been making birds all morning. There are 47 birds now. That's a great many birds." "Yes." Rowan looked at her with that gray, direct gaze. "Can I stay here with you?" She considered this. There were a number of reasons it was probably not ideal for one of the king's children to be sitting on the upper corridor floor, while his tutor slept and his brother made paper birds. There was also no good reason to send him back to a sleeping tutor, and sending him away would require explaining to him why, and in her experience, 6-year-olds required quite specific and satisfying explanations. "You can stay," she said, "if you're quiet." "I'm very quiet," he said, in a voice that was not particularly quiet. She turned back to the next section of corridor and resumed her work. Rowan sat on the floor and watched her. He was quiet for approximately 3 minutes. "Do you like it here?" he said. She kept working. "In this corridor?" "In the estate." She thought about the honest answer to this. "Most of the time," she said. "Father says you ran away." Her cloth paused on the stone for exactly half a second. She resumed. "Did he?" "He didn't say it exactly. He said you went somewhere without telling anyone, and then came back, which sounds like running away." "I had to go somewhere for a short time." "Why?" She turned and looked at him. He was watching her, with the particular straightforward interest of a child who has not yet learned that certain questions are difficult. She thought about what to say. She thought about how to be honest without being fully honest, which was a skill she had, but one that did not work very well on children, because children had not yet developed the adult habit of accepting incomplete answers. "I was scared," she said. He considered this. Of what? Of things changing. He thought about that for a while. "I don't like things changing either," he said. "When Mum died, everything changed. We had new people and new rules, and Father was different." She sat down on the floor across from him, which was not a thing she had planned to do, but which seemed like the appropriate response to the weight of what he had just said. They were eye level now. "I'm sorry about your mother," she said. "I don't really remember her," he said. "Cale says he does, but I think he's mixing her up with pictures." He said this with the matter-of-fact sadness of someone who has processed a loss they did not have the words for at the time it happened. "We have pictures, though. She had dark hair like you." Elara was very still. "She did?" "Yes. And she was small. You're small." He looked at her with the same concentrated gray gaze his father used when he was thinking carefully about something. "You smell like home," he said. She heard herself say, "What does home smell like?" He seemed to give this serious thought. "Warm. And the kitchen. And outside after it rains." He considered. "And us. A little bit. Father. And Cale. And me. Like us." Elara pressed her lips together. She looked at the corridor floor. "That's a nice way to describe home," she said. "You really do smell like it," he said. "I noticed when you gave us the bread that first time." "I probably smell like the kitchen," she said. "I spend a lot of time near Cook Aldridge's ovens." "No." He was certain and unconcerned about it. "Not just that. Something else. He looked at her with absolute simplicity. Cale said so too. We talked about it. He said maybe you were supposed to be here. She breathed carefully through her nose. Cale is very wise for 6, she said. He's 2 minutes older than me, Rowan said. He thinks that counts for a lot. She almost laughed, which would have been the first real laugh in several days. The sound of running feet came from around the corner, and then Cale appeared, slightly breathless, his hair more disordered than his brother's, a paper bird in each hand. He saw Alara on the floor and stopped. I heard your voice, he said, not to Rowan, to her. I'm cleaning the corridor, she said. Rowan was keeping me company. Cale came and sat down beside his brother without being asked, and for a moment, all 3 of them were simply sitting on the stone floor of the upper corridor in the morning light from the narrow windows, and it was one of those moments that has no particular dramatic quality except the quality of being very real. Cale held out one of the paper birds. This one's yours, he said. I made it for you. The wings fold properly. She took it. She held it in her palm. It was small and white, and made from a page of some document that had been repurposed without ceremony. One wing was very slightly higher than the other, which gave it the look of something caught mid-turn. Thank you, she said. It's beautiful. You can keep it, he said. I have 46 others. 47, Rowan corrected. I gave one away. 46 then. They looked at each other in the swift, argumentative way of twins who have had this kind of exchange 10,000 times. Then Cale turned back to Alara and pressed his nose briefly against her wrist in the sudden, instinctive way of a small wolf who was in the habit of sensing things through scent, and then pulled back and looked at her with the same focused gray eyes his brother had used. You're going to stay, he said. Not a question. She looked at him. I hope so, she said. He nodded, as if this were a perfectly satisfactory answer to a question he had already known the answer to. She sat on the stone floor with the 2 boys for another 10 minutes, until Rowan began telling her about a bird he had seen in the north garden that morning, that might or might not have been a real owl, and Cale interrupted to say it was definitely not an owl, because owls didn't come out until evening, and Rowan said it was an exception owl, and this argument was still ongoing, when Mr. Finch appeared around the corner looking crumpled and apologetic. Your Highnesses, he said, with the expression of a man who has just woken up and found himself responsible for the whereabouts of 2 6-year-olds who could apparently go anywhere they liked, inside a very large stone building. There you are. We're here, Rowan confirmed. So I see. Shall we return to our lessons? Cale stood up and dusted himself off with great dignity. Rowan stood up and didn't bother with the dusting. They left with Mr. Finch. Cale looked back once. She raised the paper bird in her palm. He disappeared around the corner. She sat on the stone floor for another minute after they had gone, alone in the upper corridor, with the small paper bird in her palm, and the tin pressed against her ribs, and a feeling moving through her that was the specific, terrifying quality of a door that has been shut for a very long time, and has just, without warning, been opened from the other side. She pressed her free hand flat against the pocket with the tin. She sat with it. Then she stood up, tucked the paper bird into her apron pocket, picked up her cloth, and went back to work. That evening, after supper in the servants' hall, she went to the east sitting room without being summoned. She knocked twice, waited, and entered when she heard his voice. Damon was reading at the small desk near the window, which was where he often read in the evenings when the day's formal business was done. He set the book down when she came in, which he always did, and that small, consistent courtesy was something she had started to notice, and then tried to stop noticing, and had not succeeded at. She sat in her chair. He waited. She took the tin from her pocket and set it on the small table between them. He looked at it without touching it. There is something I need to tell you, she said. I've been working up to it for several days, and I think I've run out of time to work up to it. So I'm going to say it quickly, because if I say it slowly, I'll find a way to say something else instead. All right, he said. She looked at the fire. I am carrying your child, she said. The fire crackled. She kept her eyes on it. I don't know if you remember the night of the last blood moon 3 years ago, she said, because I was not yet working in this household then, and you were at a separate estate, and I was someone entirely different in a life I was trying to leave behind. But we met, briefly. You were there on diplomatic business and I was there, and there was a night when things happened that I never expected, and that I have never been able to fully explain, even to myself. She stopped. The fire. I discovered 3 months later that I was expecting a child. By then I had moved, more than once. I had been trying to distance myself from anything related to your territory, your court, your household, but I had almost no money, and no safe place, and no one who could help. And someone told me that the estate in the Northern Territories was taking on domestic staff, and that it was a good household, and that the work was steady. And I thought, if I can get inside those walls, I can be safe. I can have the child somewhere safe, and figure out the rest after. She stopped again. But I was already 4 months along by the time I arrived, and I knew that was not long enough. So I told myself I would stay another month, and then the months kept going, and the child, her voice did not waver. She was very controlled. The child was still born. In the winter of my first year here, Cook Aldridge found me, and got the healer, and between them they managed it quietly. They were very kind. They asked nothing. I told no one else. She breathed. And I told myself that was the end of it. That the whole thing, the meeting, the child, the secret, was over, and could be sealed away, and I could go on. And I kept the tin because there was a flower from that morning, before I knew any of it, when the day was still ordinary, and I needed to remember that days can be ordinary. She looked at the fire for a long time. And then the blood moon came again this year, she said. And I was in the hall with the candle snuffer, and you looked at me. She stopped. She did not say what had happened between the blood moon ceremony this year and the present morning. She did not need to. The mate bond was not a fact that needed explaining to a wolf who had been feeling its pull for a week. She had seen the recognition in his face on the stairs. She had seen it in the sitting room every morning. She had sat across from it every day, and waited for it to become something she had words for. She looked at the tin. The child we lost, she said. I named her. I never told anyone, but I named her. She pressed her fingers against the tin's lid. I want you to know that I was not going to use it, she said. I was not going to come to you with a story, or a claim, or anything that required something from you. I came to this estate for safety, not for any other reason. And when you started noticing me, my first thought was not opportunity. My first thought was danger, because a man with your power and your court, if he knew about a lost child from an unknown woman, could decide that woman was a problem. She looked at him. That is why I ran. Not because I was lying. Not because I wanted to leave. Because I was afraid of what you would do when you knew. The fire burned between them. He was completely still. She picked up the tin and put it back in her pocket and folded her hands in her lap and looked at the fire and waited for whatever came next. Damon did not speak for a long time. The fire between them was the only thing in the room that moved, the orange light shifting across the stone, finding edges and releasing them. Elara sat in her chair with her hands folded, and her back straight, and her face turned toward the fire, because looking at him right now was something she could not do. She had said the thing. She had put it in the room between them like an object set down on a table, and it was there now, occupying space, and she could not take it back, and she had not expected to want to, but she had also not expected how quiet the room would become afterward. She counted the seconds. She reached 43 before he moved. He did not stand. He leaned forward in his chair, elbows on his knees, and pressed his fingers together in front of his face, in the manner of someone applying physical pressure to a thought. She heard him breathe. 3 years ago, he said, his voice was low and careful. The diplomatic stay in the eastern province, at the Harwood estate. She did not know the name of the estate. She had only known it as the place she had been working that autumn, the household of a minor lord who ran a small but decent house, and employed local staff, and had not been particularly relevant to the larger world, until a visiting Alpha King's entourage had required accommodation for 2 nights. I don't know the name, she said. I only worked there briefly. It was in October, he said. October, 3 years ago. Yes. He was quiet again. He unfolded his hands and pressed them flat against his knees, and looked at the fire with the focused expression of someone who is locating a specific memory inside a large and crowded archive. I was not myself that night, he said quietly. I want you to understand that. Not as an excuse. As context. She turned her head and looked at him. He was not looking at her. He was still looking at the fire. It was the anniversary of Mara's death. My wife. She died in October, 4 years ago. I had been traveling for 2 weeks, and I had not slept properly, and I was, he paused, in a state. There was wine at dinner, and I left early, and the night is not fully clear to me in the way that some nights are not fully clear. She said, I know. He looked at her then. I remember more of it than you might expect, she said. You were in pain. It was the kind of pain that is very honest, that does not perform itself. I have seen grief perform itself in a lot of people, and yours was not performing. You were simply where you were, and I was nearby. He held her gaze. I did not take advantage of anything, she said. I want you to know that. Neither did you. It was, she looked for the word, and found only the right one, a collision. Two people who were both somewhere other than where they usually were, meeting in a place that didn't belong to either of them. He was very still. I am not telling you this to assign blame to either of us, she said. I am telling you this because you deserve the full truth. You deserve to know what happened, and why, and what became of it. A child, he said. The word was very quiet. A girl. Her voice was steady. She had practiced being steady. I named her. Her name was... I named her after the morning she was lost. I called her Morning, which is not a formal name, but it was mine to give. He said nothing for a moment. When did you know it was mine? He asked. I always knew, she said. There was no one else, and in any case, the timing was not ambiguous. He pressed his fingers together again. She could see him thinking, processing, sorting through what he had been handed, and what to do with it. She had expected anger, or denial, or the particular kind of defensive coldness that powerful men used when they were confronted with things that did not fit their plans. She had expected it, and had prepared for it. She had not prepared for what she saw instead. She had not prepared for the grief. It was in his face, in the same way it had been in her own face, in the first months after, when she had been alone with it, and had had to carry it without anyone to share it with. It was not performed. It was not managed. It was simply there. I would have wanted to know, he said. She absorbed this. I didn't think so, she said. You didn't trust me to. I didn't trust anyone to, she said. I'm sorry. That is not an excuse either. He looked at the fire. Then he looked at her. Why didn't you leave the estate afterward, when you had decided it was safe enough to grieve privately and move on? Why didn't you go? She thought about the truth of this. Because the morning after, she said slowly, when Cook Aldridge made me sit down and eat something, and brought me tea, and said nothing at all about what had happened, and simply kept working in the kitchen the way he always did, and the smell of the bread was in the air, and through the window, I could see the north garden starting to come into winter, and it was ordinary. It was just an ordinary morning, and I had not had enough of those. He was quiet. And then more mornings came, she said, and more seasons, and I got very good at being invisible, and the estate became what an estate becomes when you stop thinking of it as temporary. She looked at her hands, and then the blood moon came again, and you looked at me, and I understood that the ordinary mornings were going to end. They don't have to end, he said. She looked at him. I need you to understand something, he said, with a care that she recognized as the care of someone choosing words that will carry weight and wanting to get them right. What you have carried, these 3 years, that should not have been yours to carry alone. She looked at the fire. I know, she said quietly, but I had no other option. You could have come to me. I was a maid from a forged letter, who could not prove anything, she said. Who would have believed me? And even if I had been believed, then what? The court, the council, the pack hierarchy. I had seen enough of how those things work to know that a human woman making claims about the Alpha King would not have been treated with kindness. He exhaled. It was a controlled exhale, the kind that contains something larger than itself. You're right, he said. The court would have been difficult. The council would have been worse. He said it with the honesty of someone who did not like what they were admitting, but would not deny it. That is a failure. Not yours. The structures. She nodded. But things are different now, he said. She looked at him. You are not a maid from a forged letter, he said. You are the woman who has been sitting in that chair every morning for a week. You are the woman my sons brought paper birds to on the upper corridor floor. You are. He stopped, and the pause had a quality she recognized now, the quality of the mate bond trying to find words for itself, and not quite managing the leap from instinct to language. You are mine, he said. I don't know how to say that without it sounding like something it isn't, so I'll say it plainly. My wolf has known what you are to me since the blood moon. I have been going slowly, because I understood you needed slow. But I want you to hear it from me directly, not as ownership, as fact. She looked at him for a long time. Your wolf has known, she said. And you? I have been catching up, he said, with the brief, exact honesty of someone who is done pretending. She breathed slowly. Outside the window, the north garden was dark, the kitchen garden, a gray suggestion of shapes in the evening. The fire was lower now, settling into steady orange. There is still the matter of what I told you, she said, about the child, and about Varric. We'll handle Varric, he said. That is not your problem to manage. And the other thing? He looked at her steadily. We lost a child, he said. Not you. We. The word sat between them. She did not trust herself to say anything for a moment. She looked at the fire and breathed very carefully. All right, she said. I would like to know her name, he said quietly. The name you gave her. She pressed her hand against her pocket. Morning, she said. He repeated it softly, not in question. In acknowledgement. They sat with it for a while, both of them, in the small sitting room, with the fire going low, and the north garden dark outside, and the weight of 3 years, and one grief between them, beginning, slowly, and without fanfare, to be shared. She did not cry. She had done her crying a long time ago in private, in the specific way of people who have no one to cry with, and must do it efficiently. But she felt something ease in her chest that she had not known was tightened, a held breath released. What happens now? She said, when the fire had burned down to its quietest. Now, he said, you stay, and we figure out the rest as we go. The council, she said. They will have opinions. They always do. This is different. I know. He met her eyes. I told you I would handle Varric. I am telling you the same about the council. That is a considerable promise. I am aware of that. She looked at him. She thought about the 18 months she had spent before coming to this estate, running and working and hiding and managing a secret that was the size of a life. She thought about the 3 years of ceilings and cold floors and perfect invisibility. She thought about Kale's paper bird in her apron pocket, one wing slightly higher than the other. I will hold you to it, she said. I expect you to. She stood up from the chair. He stood too, which he always did when she left the room, and which still surprised her every time, the fact of being treated with that specific, unconditional courtesy by someone who could choose not to bother. She walked to the door. She stopped. Thank you, she said, for listening. Thank you, he said, for telling me. She went out into the corridor and walked the long way back to the servants' quarters, through the lower hall and past the kitchen and through the side corridor. And Cook Aldridge was still in the kitchen at this late hour, doing something slow and complicated with tomorrow's preparations, and he looked up when she passed the doorway and said nothing, just raised his chin, the slight amount that meant, all right, and she gave the small nod that meant, yes. He went back to his work. She went to her room and sat on her bed. She took the tin from her pocket and held it in her hands in the dark without opening it. For the first time in 3 years, the weight of it felt different, not lighter. It would never be lighter. But it was not hers alone anymore, and the difference between carrying something by yourself and carrying it with someone is not the weight of the thing. It is the position of your hands. She set the tin on the shelf above her bed, beside the book and the folded paper. She lay down. She did not count the cracks in the ceiling. She lay in the dark and listened to the estate settle around her, the old stone making its slow sounds, and she thought about what he had said. We lost a child, not you. We. And then she closed her eyes, and for the first time in a very long time, she slept through the whole night without waking. The council meeting was called 3 days later. Elara did not know it was happening until she heard the voices from the corridor outside the large meeting room on the second floor. voices that carried even through closed stone doors when enough people were talking at the same time, and that had a particular sharp, pressured quality that told her the conversation inside was not going well for whoever was being discussed. She was carrying folded letters to the upper study when she heard it. She slowed her pace without stopping. Through the door, she caught words. Her name. Then, human. Then Damon's voice. Quiet and level in the way it went quiet and level when he was controlling something he felt strongly about. She kept walking. She delivered the letters to the study. She went back down to the corridor. The voices were still audible. She told herself not to stand at doors and listen, which was a piece of advice she had given Clara several times, and which she immediately ignored. She stood at a careful distance and listened. The council had 12 members. She knew all their names from 3 years of observing from doorways and corridors. The one speaking now was Lord Varick, and she recognized his voice, because it had a particular carrying quality, the trained voice of a man who had spent 40 years in rooms where being heard was a form of power. The matter of the household maid is a separate issue from the matter of her origins, Varick was saying. I am raising it not as a grievance but as a practical concern. The girl has a connection to my territory. She left under unclear circumstances. Having her in proximity to, she has a connection to your territory, Damon said, and his voice had the quality of a door being closed, because a member of your estate staff behaved in a way that made her position there impossible. She left because she had no safe option for remaining. That is the circumstance. A pause, then a different voice, older, belonging to the council's eldest member, a man named Harwick, who had sat on the council for 30 years, and who Alara had always observed to be the kind of person whose opinions shifted with whoever had most recently spoken directly to him. The king's interest in domestic staff is, of course, his own affair, Harwick said carefully. The council's concern is a broader one. Questions of precedent, questions of bloodline, said a third voice, blunt and undecorated. Lord Callum, who sat at the near end of the table, and who had been Damon's most consistent critic on the council, for as long as anyone could remember. He said it without apology. A human woman, in proximity to the king, sets a precedent. Precedents have consequences. You are describing a serving staff member, Damon said. I am describing what I see, Callum said, and what the pack will see. A human who vanished overnight, and was retrieved in person by the Alpha King, does not read as serving staff. It reads as something else, and the pack deserves clarity. There was a short silence. Then I will give them clarity, Damon said. Alara stood very still in the corridor outside. Sir. That was Lieutenant Colt's voice, which meant he was in the room too, which meant this was more formal than a regular council meeting. The council is raising legitimate structural concerns. I understand what the council is raising, Damon said. I have sat in this room for 8 years, and I know every structural concern this table is capable of producing. This is not a structural concern. This is politics, dressed in structural language, and I have run out of patience for the distinction being managed quietly. Another silence. Alara heard someone's chair shift on the floor. Let me be very clear, Damon said, and his voice did not rise, but the air in the corridor seemed to carry it more plainly, as if the words were taking up more room than usual. Alara Voss is under my direct protection. Any inquiry from any lord's household regarding her origins, her movements, or her history will be directed to me and will receive my personal response. Any council member who wishes to raise questions about my household staff will raise them to me in private, and not in a formal session, convened to imply censure, before the matter has been presented to me directly. A very complete silence. Furthermore, he said, in the same level voice, the matter of Soren and Varick's household will be referred to the pack's legal counsel for formal review. The conduct described to me warrants it. I trust Varick will cooperate fully. From inside the room, she heard Varick say nothing, which was its own answer. This meeting is concluded, Damon said. The sound of chairs, the sound of people standing. She moved away from the door quickly and went down the corridor to the far end, where a window looked out onto the main courtyard, and she stood there with her back to the corridor and looked at the courtyard below and breathed. She had expected a version of this. She had told herself she was prepared for it. She had been lying to herself in the specific way that you lie to yourself when you are prepared for a thing intellectually, but have not yet allowed yourself to feel the full weight of it. The council thought she was a problem. Lord Varick wanted her removed or discredited. Lord Callum thought her presence set a dangerous precedent. Even those who said nothing had said nothing in a particular way. That meant they were waiting to see which direction the situation developed before committing to a position. And Damon had stood in that room and said, "She is under my direct protection," and had said, "Any inquiry will receive my personal response." She looked at the courtyard below. 2 grooms were crossing it with horses, speaking casually to each other about something ordinary. The afternoon light was golden on the stone. She heard footsteps behind her and turned. Damon came down the corridor with Lieutenant Colt half a step behind him and 2 guards at a further distance. He saw her at the window and he stopped. They looked at each other. He said, quietly, so only she would hear, "You heard." It was not a question. "Yes," she said. He sent Colt on ahead with a brief gesture, and the guards followed, and then it was only the 2 of them at the far end of the corridor, with the window behind her, and the afternoon light making the stone walls look warmer than they were. "Are you all right?" he asked. She thought about this honestly. "I expected it," she said. "Mostly. But not entirely." "Not entirely," she admitted. Hearing it stated plainly in that particular tone is different from imagining it. He leaned against the opposite wall and looked at her with the quiet, direct attention he brought to everything she said. "Varick is going to push," he said. "He has reasons beyond the official ones. He knows the formal review of Soren is not going to go well for him, and he'd prefer to have you discredited before that process begins." "How long will the review take?" "Months. Pack legal proceedings move slowly by design." He crossed his arms. "In the meantime, you will continue to be a topic of discussion in rooms I'm not always in." She looked at the courtyard. "And Callum?" "Callum doesn't like me. This is the most recent version of a long pattern. He will use whatever is available. When there's nothing available, he invents something." He paused. "He's not wrong that your presence raises questions. He is wrong about whether those questions are ones I intend to answer to his satisfaction." She looked at him. "You said you would handle the council." "I will." "What does that mean, in concrete terms?" He held her gaze. "It means that I am going to formally address the pack within the month. My standing with the pack directly is stronger than my standing with the council, because the pack responds to an alpha's direct communication in a way that 12 lords with competing interests cannot replicate. I intend to speak plainly to them about what you are to me, and why that is not a subject for council debate." She was quiet for a moment. "You're going to tell the pack about the mate bond," she said. "Yes. Before I have decided whether I accept it." He looked at her steadily. "Do you need more time?" She thought about the paper bird in her apron pocket. She thought about Rowan's "you smell like home," and the way he had said it, as if it were a simple fact rather than anything complicated. She thought about the tin on the shelf above her bed, and the fire going low, and "we lost a child. Not you. We." "No," she said, "I don't need more time." His expression shifted in the same way it had in the forest, that change that was too small to have a name, but that occupied more room than most large expressions. "Then I'll speak to the pack," he said. "There will still be pushback," she said. "Yes. Callum, Varick, and whoever aligns with them. It won't be peaceful." "No," he agreed. "It won't be peaceful. It will be difficult and political, and there will be several very long months of people saying things in rooms I'm not always in." He looked at her without pretense. "I want you to hear that directly. I am not going to tell you that this is simple, or that the court will simply accept it. They won't, immediately. It will take time. And while it's taking time, you will be under my direct protection, which is not symbolic, which means my guards, my authority, and my personal attention." She looked at him. "You have already put yourself at significant political cost for someone you have known for 2 weeks, she said. 3 years, he said quietly. She absorbed that. "That is not how it works," she said. "No," he said. "But it is how it is." She looked at the courtyard below. The grooms were gone. The light had moved. The stone was cooling to its usual gray. She thought about all the exits she had identified in her first year at the estate, the routes, and the gates, and the hours they were locked. She thought about how clearly she had known every way out of this building for 3 years, and how completely she had stopped thinking about them in the past week. "Callum said something," she said, "that I want to address." He waited. "He said the pack deserves clarity." She looked at Damon. "I think he's right. Not for his reasons, but because I don't want to be a secret. I have been someone's secret before, and not by choice, and I am done with that." He was very still. "If you speak to the pack," she said, "speak plainly. Not the council's version of plainly, which is careful and strategic. Actually plainly. Say what is true." "All right," he said. "And I would like to be there when you say it." He looked at her. Something moved in his expression that she recognized now, the particular quality of surprise that comes not from the unexpectedness of a thing, but from the correctness of it, from being shown the right answer at the moment you were looking for it. "Yes," he said. She nodded. She tucked her hands into her apron and looked at the courtyard one more time. A wind moved through the north garden, and the tops of the trees in it shifted briefly, a wave of motion that crossed the visible sky above the courtyard wall, and was gone. "Clara asked me this morning if I was all right," she said. "I told her yes, and then she hugged me without warning." He blinked, slightly. "She's been talking to Cook Aldridge," Ilara said. "Who has been talking to no one specific, but who apparently communicates through bread somehow. I don't understand it fully. But I think what I'm saying is that the servants' hall knows something is different, and they seem to be," she paused, "not opposed to it." "Good," he said. "Clara also told me that she made Rowan a new paper bird this morning, because apparently he is collecting them from anyone willing to make them." She met his eyes. "Your son has started a movement." This time the thing that crossed his face was absolutely a smile. Brief and contained, but entirely real. "I'll speak to him," he said. "Please don't," she said. "I think it's the most wonderful thing happening in this building right now." He looked at her for a moment. "You're going to be very difficult," he said. "Yes," she said. "I am. I hope that's clear." "It has been," he said. "From the first time you refused to answer a direct question in this building." She almost smiled back, almost. She straightened her apron and picked up her cleaning cloth from where she had set it on the window ledge and said, "I should get back to the corridor." "Ilara." She turned. He was looking at her with the full weight of his attention, and he said, simply, "Whatever comes next, I want you to know that you do not navigate it alone. That is done." She held his gaze. "All right," she said. She walked back down the corridor toward the stairs, past the closed door of the meeting room, where 12 lords had just finished arranging their concerns about her existence, and she went back to her cleaning with steady hands and a chest that felt, for the first time in a very long time, like it had room to breathe. Behind her, the Alpha King stood at the corridor window and watched the north garden for a while and said nothing. Below in the kitchen, a new batch of bread was rising. The pack assembly was held on the last Friday of the month. It was not a ceremony. It was not the blood moon or any of the other formal occasions she had learned to navigate in 3 years. It was simply the thing it was called, an assembly. The pack gathered in the large stone courtyard at the front of the estate, the one used for formal address, and the Alpha King stood on the raised platform at its far end and spoke directly to the people he governed. She had never attended one before. Assemblies were not usually announced to household staff. They were pack affairs, internal communications between the Alpha and his people, conducted without the presence of the domestic workforce, unless there was a specific reason. She was standing at the back of the crowd, which Damon had suggested, and which she had accepted, not because she was afraid to be visible, but because standing at the back gave her a view of everything, and she had always found the edge of a crowd more useful than its center. The day was cold and clear. The sky above the courtyard was the particular pale blue of late autumn, high and distant, with cloud formations that moved slowly from north to south, as if they were in no hurry. The pack members who had assembled numbered perhaps 200, ranging from the elders at the front to the youngest adults at the back near where she stood. There were children too, those old enough to attend formal address, and she caught sight of Rowan and Cale at the front on either side of their tutor, Mr. Finch, who looked simultaneously proud and anxious in the way of a man who has been given an important responsibility and is aware that its successful outcome does not depend on him. Cale spotted her before Rowan did. From 40 feet away, across the assembled pack, the 6-year-old turned his head with the unerring directness of a wolf's sense, and looked straight at her, and raised one hand. She raised hers in return. Rowan saw the gesture and turned too, and she saw him mouth something to his brother and Cale nod. She breathed. Damon came onto the platform from the side entrance, at exactly the time he always arrived for formal occasions, which was neither early nor late, but precisely when expected. He wore the estate's formal colors, dark and silver, but without any of the ceremonial weight that the blood moon had required. He looked like himself, which was the most commanding version of himself that she had observed, more than any formal coat or ceremonial occasion could produce. He was still for a moment after taking his place. The crowd settled. He spoke. He did not use the formal language of pack address, which had specific intonations and phrases that she had heard from the distant edge of other assemblies. He used his own voice, the way he used it in the sitting room, measured and direct. "I want to speak to you today about something that is not a matter of policy or territory or pack law," he said. "It is a matter of my household, and of myself, and of something that I owe you plainly." The courtyard was very quiet. "There is a woman in my household who you may know as one of the domestic staff. Her name is Ilara Voss. She has worked in this estate for 3 years. She has done her work without complaint, and with a quality of character that is, in my experience, uncommon." He paused. "She is also, as I have known for several weeks now, and as my wolves have known for somewhat longer, my fated mate." The silence changed. Not a sound, still, but a change in the quality of it, the particular way a crowd holds itself when it is absorbing something significant. "I am telling you this directly, rather than allowing it to be managed through rumor and council discussion, because you deserve that directness," he said. "There are members of the council who have concerns. Some of those concerns are about precedent. Some are about bloodline. Some, if I am being fully plain, are about something much simpler, which is that Ilara is human, and pack tradition has not frequently produced this kind of claim." He looked at the assembled crowd without performance, simply looked at them. "I am going to tell you what I have learned in the weeks since the blood moon," he said. "Ilara Voss is not a person who requires explaining. She is not someone whose presence in my life needs defending as a policy position. She is simply who she is, and who she is has been visible to this household for 3 years, to those who chose to see it." At the front of the crowd, she saw Cook Aldridge's broad shoulders. She saw Mr. Hollis. She saw Clara, smaller than the people around her, turned slightly to look back toward the edge of the crowd where Ilara stood. Clara's expression, when she found her, was the specific expression of someone who is trying very hard not to cry and is not entirely succeeding. Ilara looked back at the platform. "I am not asking the pack to make a decision," Damon said. "I am not presenting this for a vote or a consensus. I am informing you, as your alpha, of a fact. Ilara is under my protection, and under pack protection. She is part of this household, in a way that I intend to make permanent. I expect her to be treated accordingly." He stopped. He looked out at the crowd for a moment. Then he said, more quietly, in a way that still carried, "I also want to say one other thing, which is not a formal statement, but which I want said in front of all of you. The mate bond is not something I went looking for. It found me in the middle of a grief I had not finished processing, and it chose someone unexpected, and it was inconvenient and complicated, and I resisted it longer than I should have, because resistance felt like control, and I was not in the mood to be surprised." He paused. "I am done resisting it. What I have found in Ilara, which is honesty and intelligence and a quality of steadiness that this household has always had without my understanding where it came from, is something I am not willing to diminish for anyone's comfort. Not the council's, not the court's, not anyone's." He looked out once more. "That is all," he said. He stepped down from the platform. The crowd absorbed the silence for another moment. Then someone near the front, she did not see who, made the low collective sound that the pack used in ceremony, that harmonic note that was not quite a word, but carried meaning. It was answered by another, and then another. Not all of them, but enough. She stood at the edge of the crowd and felt the sound move through the cold autumn air. Cale turned around again from the front of the crowd and found her with his gray eyes, and held up one paper bird above his head. White and small, one wing slightly higher, just visible in the crowd. She pressed her hand over her pocket where the original bird still lived. The assembly dispersed slowly, the way crowds disperse when they are still holding the weight of something they have heard. She stayed at the edge and waited. People walked past her. A few looked at her with curiosity. One older woman, whose name she did not know, looked at her with an expression that was neither hostile nor welcoming, but simply the expression of someone revising an assumption they had held for years. She stood still and let herself be seen. It was the opposite of everything she had practiced for 3 years, and it was terrifying, and she stood still and did it anyway. Damon found her after most of the crowd had moved back inside. He came directly to where she was standing, which she had expected, and he stood in front of her and looked at her, which she had also expected, and then he said nothing for a moment, which she had not expected but which felt correct. She spoke first. "You didn't tell me you were going to say all of that. I know. I thought you were going to make a formal statement. I did. That was not a formal statement," she said. "That was what you actually think." "Yes," he said. She looked at him. The cold air was between them, and the sound of the crowd dispersing from the courtyard behind her, and the high pale sky above. "You said resistance," she said. "You said you'd resisted it. For several weeks. What stopped?" He held her gaze with the specific and complete attention that she was still, after everything, not entirely used to receiving. "You stopped," he said. "Sitting in that chair every morning, and telling me the truth, and looking at the fire, when things were too large to say, and looking directly at me when they weren't." He paused. "You stopped the resistance." She breathed carefully. "I need you to understand," she said, "that accepting this does not mean I am without conditions." "I know," he said. "I will not reduce myself to fit anyone's idea of what this should look like. Not the councils, not the courts. I know. And if you attempt to manage my decisions the way you manage political decisions, I will tell you directly, and I will expect you to listen. I know." "You agreed to all of that very quickly," she said. "Because I have spent 3 weeks watching you, and I would agree to significantly more difficult terms than those to keep you in this building." She absorbed that. A gust of wind came through the courtyard and lifted a handful of dry leaves from the corner where they had gathered, and set them turning briefly in the air before letting them go. "I am still afraid," she said. "I want you to know that. I am less afraid than I was a week ago, and considerably less afraid than I was on the night of the blood moon, but I am not without fear. I want to be honest about that." "All right," he said. "Fear does not mean doubt," she said. "I want that to be clear too." "It is clear," he said. She looked at him for one more long moment. She thought about all the words she had spent 3 years not saying, and the weight they had carried, and the strange relief of the past 10 days of saying them. She said, "The paper bird Cale gave me. I have it in my pocket." He blinked, slightly. "I have been carrying it for 2 weeks," she said, "which is longer than I have carried most things intentionally. I usually keep myself light." His expression did the thing, the small one, the one that covered more distance than large expressions. "Cale will be pleased to know it," he said. "He already knows it," she said. 6-year-olds with wolf instincts know an alarming amount." She reached into her apron pocket and took out the paper bird and held it in her palm between them. Small and white and imperfect, with one wing lifted. He looked at it. She looked at him. "I accept the mate bond," she said quietly. "Not because I have no choice, because I am choosing it. I want that distinction to be permanent." He held her gaze. "It will be," he said. She closed her fingers around the paper bird and put it back in her pocket. The courtyard was nearly empty now. The sky was moving its clouds from north to south in that slow, unhurried progression. The estate waited around them with the patience of old stone. She held out her hand. He took it. His hand was large and warm, and she felt the mate bond settle in her chest, the way something settles when it finds the place it was always going to rest, with a kind of final, unmistakable rightness that had nothing to do with ease or simplicity, and everything to do with truth. They stood like that in the empty courtyard for a long moment. Then she said, "Your sons are probably making 60 paper birds right now." He exhaled. "Almost certainly," he said. "We should go in." "We should." Neither of them moved immediately. The cold air held them there a moment longer. This woman, who had learned to disappear, and this king, who had learned to stop looking, until he couldn't stop looking anymore, standing with their hands joined in a courtyard that smelled of autumn and old stone and the faint green persistence of the north garden behind the wall. Then they went inside, side by side, as agreed. 3 months after the assembly in the courtyard, the Pack's legal council issued its formal findings on the matter of Soren, estate manager of Lord Varric's household. The document was 6 pages long and set out in the careful, dense language of Pack law, and Alara read every word of it at the desk in Damon's study while he sat in the chair near the window and did not pretend to be doing something else. The document confirmed that the conduct described by Alara, and, it turned out, by 2 other women who had worked in Varric's household in the previous 4 years, constituted a formal violation of Pack conduct standards. Soren was removed from his position. A financial penalty was levied against Varric's estate for failure to supervise and respond to formal and informal complaints. The 2 other women were named in the document by their own choice. Ilara was named as Alara Voss, under the direct protection of the Alpha King, which was a particular formulation of language in Pack law that she had since learned carried very specific weight. She set the document down when she finished. "Well," she said. "Yes," he said. She looked at the document, then at the window. The north garden was different in winter, the trees bare, the herbs cut back, the stone path between the beds showing more clearly without the summer growth around it. She had started learning the names of the herbs from Cook Aldridge, who had opinions about all of them. "The other 2 women," she said. "I know. I would like to write to them. I'll get you the contact information." She nodded. She pushed the document slightly to one side and looked at the desk surface beneath it. 3 months had made this study familiar, not in the way the servants' quarters were familiar, not in the particular way of a space that you inhabit alone and make narrow and carefully contained, in the larger way, the way of a space that belongs to both of you, that has your book on one end of the shelf and his on the other, and the paper birds on the middle shelf where Cale had arranged them during his last visit, and Damon had not moved them. There were 14 paper birds on the shelf. Cale was still making them, but more slowly now, with greater care for the angles. He had recently been experimenting with different paper types, and had opinions about which ones folded more precisely. Alara's original bird was on the shelf too. Cale had found it in her apron pocket 3 weeks after giving it to her, and had taken it, with the unself-conscious confidence of a child who considers things he has made to be partially his, regardless of where they live, examined it critically, and returned it with the comment that the one wing was intentional, not a mistake, because birds were never perfectly symmetrical anyway. She had agreed that this was true. "Varric will push back," she said, "on the financial penalty. He is already pushing back. And I have made clear that the findings stand. He knows the position. If he wishes to escalate, he is welcome to bring a formal challenge, at which point the matter becomes considerably more expensive for him rather than less." She turned in the chair and looked at him. He was reading something at the window, or had been before she began speaking. He was not a man who performed patience. He simply had it, in the way that people have things they have developed over a long time for useful reasons. "You are very calm about this," she said. "Varric has been an irritant for 4 years. This is the most recent version of a long pattern. He does not have the political weight to do meaningful damage, and he knows it. He is making noise." He set his reading down. "I have more important things to think about." She looked at him. "Do you?" she said. He returned her look with the same seriousness. "Yes." She turned back to the desk and picked up the legal document and put it in the appropriate folder, which was a habit she had developed, keeping his desk organized in the way she organized everything, with a precision that he had initially tried to argue with, and then, after 3 weeks, had stopped arguing with, because the system worked better than what had existed before. He had said so directly, which had surprised her, the simplicity of the admission. She had told him she was not surprised, and he had said he was aware she wasn't. She had liked that. She liked many things about the mornings in the study. The quality of the light through the window, the smell of whatever Cook Aldridge was doing downstairs, which changed daily and was always interesting. The fact that his meetings were scheduled in the afternoons, and the mornings were therefore reliably quiet. The fact that Cale and Rowan ambushed both of them equally now, with the serene confidence of children who have decided that a space belongs to them as a matter of structural fact rather than invitation. She liked that the estate felt different to her now. Not smaller. The corridors were the same length, the rooms the same size, the cold still in the floors in the morning before the fires were lit. But the relationship she had with all of it was different. She was not mapping exits anymore. She had not, she realized sometime around the 4th week after the assembly, thought about exits in any practical sense for some time. She was not invisible. This was the strangest part, and the most significant. The invisibility that had been her primary skill, and her primary protection, and, she now admitted to herself, her primary source of loneliness, was gone. The servants who had barely registered her existence for 3 years, now said good morning, and asked how she was. Clara had become what she supposed was an actual friend, in the specific and warm sense of someone who appeared beside you with tea when you had been sitting alone for too long, and who made you laugh with reports of Mr. Finch's continuing struggles with 47 paper birds worth of distraction. Mr. Hollis had acknowledged the change in her status with a single sentence, delivered in the same tone as all his other communications. "We are very glad you chose to remain with us, Miss Voss." She had almost hugged him. She had restrained herself and said thank you, and he had given his characteristic one-eyebrow acknowledgement and moved on. And this exchange had, in its entirety, constituted Mr. Hollis, expressing significant emotion. Cook Aldridge had expressed it differently. He had made her a specific bread roll that she had once mentioned, offhandedly, was her favorite kind, and he had done it without any announcement, just left it on the kitchen counter, where she would find it on the morning after the assembly. And when she had found it, she had stood in the kitchen for a moment, and pressed her hand over her ribs where the tin used to press, and felt the difference between that pressure and this one. The council had not resolved itself cleanly. She had not expected it to. Callum still disagreed with the situation on principle, and said so in sessions she was told about by Damon in the evenings, with the quiet factual tone of someone reporting weather. Veyrick continued to be what Damon called an irritant. 2 other council members had taken positions of careful neutrality that could tip in either direction, depending on which way the political air moved. But 6 of the 12 had been direct and unambiguous in their acceptance, and in a 12-member council, 6 was enough to work with. The pack itself had been different from the council, in the specific way that large groups of ordinary people are always different from the political bodies that claim to represent them. There had been curiosity. There had been some distance, from individuals who were conservative in their inclinations, or who had strong feelings about tradition. But there had also been, from the larger portion of the people who worked and lived in the estate's orbit, something that she had not expected, and did not quite know how to name except as ordinary welcome. The groom who managed the stables had begun saying good morning to her. The woman who ran the upper laundry had shown her, without being asked, the most efficient way to collect the family's clothing without disturbing the morning flow of traffic in the upper corridor. 2 of the older pack women who lived in the village and came in for market days had stopped her once to look at her with the frank evaluation of women who have seen a great deal and have decided to form their own opinion rather than borrowing anyone else's, and one of them had said, "You've got good sense about you. I can see why he made up his mind." She had not known what to say to that except thank you. She was still learning how to be thanked and welcomed and seen. 3 years of invisibility had made her fluent in a language she was now unlearning word by word. She took the folded piece of paper from the pocket she still carried it in, out of habit, and set it on the desk. Damon looked at it. He knew what it was. She had shown it to him 6 weeks ago, on an evening when they had been in the sitting room talking longer than usual, when the fire was very low and the conversation had reached one of those depths that conversations reach when 2 people are tired enough to stop performing anything and simply say what is true. She had told him, "This is a letter I wrote to myself the night before I left Veyrick's household. I wrote it so that I would remember, when things were difficult and I was tempted to simply fold myself into whatever was easiest, what I was going to try to build instead." He had asked, "May I read it?" She had said, eventually, "Not tonight." He had accepted this. She had shown it to him 2 weeks later. It was not long. It was written in her small, careful handwriting, the handwriting of someone who had learned to write with very little paper to practice on. It said, simply and without decoration, "You deserve to stand still somewhere. You don't stop until you find it." He had read it and set it down on the desk between them. and looked at it for a moment, and then said, quietly, "You found it." She had looked at the paper. "Yes," she had said. Now she folded the paper again, and put it back in her pocket, and she looked out the window at the winter garden, at the bare trees and the stone path and the high pale sky above. "There is something I want to tell you," she said. He put down what he was reading. She turned in the chair and looked at him directly, and he looked at her with the full weight of his attention, and she told him. She told him simply, because simple was the correct register for the largest things, and because they had spent enough time together by now, that she trusted him to receive simple without needing it to be made more complicated. She watched his expression. She had learned to read it very precisely over the past months. She saw the first second, which was the second of processing, not absence but active reception. She saw the second, which was the quality of controlled feeling arriving. She saw the third second, which was him, standing up and crossing the room to where she sat, and taking her hands in both of his, and looking at her with something that was beyond what she had words for, and which she suspected he didn't have words for either, which was fine, because some things do not need to be named to be real. "Are you well?" he asked. "Yes," she said. "The healer confirmed it this morning." He held her hands. She looked at him. "I'm still afraid," she said. "I know." "That is not going to help you," she said, "but I want to say it anyway." "Say it whenever you need to," he said. "I am not going anywhere." She believed him. This was the most recent and most significant thing she had learned in 3 months. She believed him. Not because she had decided to believe him, which was the way she had previously believed things, as a conscious act of will applied over a doubt that did not quite go away, but because the evidence of 3 months, quiet and consistent and specific, had built something in her that was not a decision but a fact. He was what he appeared to be. In her experience, this was the rarest possible thing. "The twins are going to have opinions," she said. He almost smiled. "They have already told me that they are getting a sibling. I asked them how they knew, and Cale said the same thing he said to you on the corridor floor." He paused. "He said you smelled right." She pressed her lips together. "He is alarmingly perceptive," she said. "He takes after someone," Damon said, and the way he said it made her look at him, and then look away, because looking at it directly was still sometimes more than she could manage. She stood up from the chair. He still held her hands. She thought about the letter in her pocket. "You deserve to stand still somewhere." She thought about the tin on the shelf above her bed, which was not her bed anymore, which was the shelf in the room that was theirs now, and which held the tin beside the book and above the extra blanket she kept there in winter. She thought about the 17 cracks in the ceiling of the servants' quarters that she had not thought about in weeks. She thought about the paper bird on the shelf in the study, with one wing slightly higher than the other. She thought about what it meant to have found the place where standing still was possible. She said, "We are going to have to tell the council." Yes. Callum is going to be insufferable. Yes. And Varric. Yes. This is going to make everything more complicated. Yes, he said. It is going to make everything more complicated, and I could not care less. She looked at him. She said, "I could not care less either." He held her gaze, and she held his, and between them was everything that had brought them here. The blood moon, and the forest, and the wet shoes, and the tin, and the paper bird, and the 17 cracks in the ceiling, and the east sitting room, and a child they had lost, who had had a name, and a whole world of complicated, tender, specific truth that was theirs now, and no one else's. She said, "Tell the cook first, before anyone else." He blinked. "If we tell Cook Aldridge," she said, "he will tell his bread, and his bread will tell the entire estate by morning, and that way, we only have to say it once." Damon looked at her for a moment. Then he laughed. It was not the contained, brief expression she had seen before. It was a real laugh, full and unguarded, the kind that comes from being surprised by genuine happiness at a moment when you are not defending against it. She listened to it. She did not laugh herself immediately. She stood and held his hands and listened to it with the specific, careful appreciation of someone who knows the rarity of what they are hearing and does not want to miss a second of it. Then she did laugh too. And the study held the sound of it the way the old stone of the estate held everything, quietly and completely, without judgment and without end. Downstairs in the kitchen, Cook Aldridge was making bread. It was rising perfectly. He would tell you this was a sign. He would be right.